I remember quite distinctly what Ayn Rand said back in the 1960s when you and I were born. That her philosophy will be the norm in the future, but not right now. It's been 50 years now.
Yep.
Why is objectivism failing us?
Well, it's not failing us.
The two of us.
I don't feel like it's failed me. I feel like it's benefited me enormously. Why are we still the minority? I think because it's hard. Because it goes against so much of what's established in the culture, so much against how people are raised and the prevalent philosophy. It challenges at least 2,000 years of thinking, really since the birth of Christianity, and even pre that, because it challenges all of Plato and much of Greek philosophy. So it's very, very challenging. And these kind of intellectual revolutions, they take time.
Intellectual revolutions?
Well, it is an intellectual revolution. It is an upheaval. It's a challenge to all the philosophical ideas. I mean, it really is amazing how many philosophical ideas Ayn Rand challenges. She's challenging religion in her metaphysics. She's challenging much of the prevalent philosophy with regard to epistemology. She's certainly challenging us ethically to think of what will make our lives the best life that it can be, rather than think about how to sacrifice to others, how to diminish our lives for the sake of others. And politically, she challenges us to advocate to believe and to advocate for freedom versus statism, which is just standard practice in the world today. So in every realm, this is a real challenge, and so it's hard, and it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time to filter into the culture and to slowly change the culture, but it will happen.
Okay.
It will happen. It is a question of how long does it take.
Are we improving in the last few decades?
Well, I think there are two things that are going on at the same time. I think we are improving. There's a huge dimension in which we are definitely improving. There are more and more and more people who believe in these ideas, who have embraced and accepted these ideas and living their life based on these ideas. Many of these ideas have filtered into the culture in positive ways, so that people have adopted parts of Ayn Rand's philosophy, if not the totality. So they've made their lives a little bit better by adopting a certain element within the philosophy, even though they're not willing to accept a challenge to everything they believe in. So they might still be religious, but they've adopted elements of Ayn Rand's ideas into their life. And we see that. Or they might still be a little statist, but maybe they've adopted some of the ideas of self-interest into their lives. So their lives are marginally better. So in that sense, I think we're improving. The number of objectivists is growing, and the influence objectivism has into the culture is growing. But at the same time, the rest of the culture is deteriorating. And the question is, what's happening faster, if you will? The deterioration in the culture or the increase in the influence of objectivism? And so far, the deterioration in culture, I think, is happening faster than the influence of objectivism. But they're both happening, right? And the positive is that these ideas are more powerful today, stronger today. More you can find more information about them. There are more books. There are more lectures. There are more courses. There's just a lot of content, and there are a lot of people who agree with the content, at least to some extent, and that's all good.
Good currency driving out bad? Is that?
Ultimately, good currency does drive. Ultimately, good currency does drive bad, and that's why I said in the end, I do think that objectivism will become the dominant philosophy in the culture.
In the next 50 years?
I doubt it.
Okay.
I doubt that we're talking about 50 years. I truly believe this is a very many decades into the future. I think this is a long-term battle, a long-term war. But again, the focus should be on your life as an individual. There's lots of good stuff in the world today. There's lots of opportunities for individuals to flourish and to be successful and to live a full life. And at the same time, there is this philosophical revolution that we need to be engaged in. But one has to realize and one has to take into account how long it takes to really change a culture's philosophical ideas.
It's a long-range battle.
It really is. I mean, even when the ideas are not as revolutionary as Ayn Rand's ideas, it can take decades.
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about ideas that are as revolutionary as hers, it takes many, many decades.
Mm-hmm. Talking about partial adoption of her ideas, what would you say to the current libertarian movement? I'm aware that Ayn Rand was critical.
Well, she was critical of the libertarian movement certainly in the 1970s. She called them hippies of the right. And really her criticism was the dominance of subjectivism as part of their philosophy. So they took from her certain elements of a political philosophy.
Like laissez-faire capitalism.
Like laissez-faire capitalism. But then they justified it on subjective values. Do whatever you feel like doing. All actions are equal in morally. So there's no moral standard. Which, of course, to her, morality was much more important because morality is how I live, much more important than the politics. They started with the politics and they ignored morality or turned morality into subjectivist field. So she rejected that and resented that. I think there's still strong elements of that within the libertarian movement as a whole, but I think there are better elements within the libertarian movement that take ideas much more seriously. And certainly when it comes to advocating for free markets and for political liberty, there's some very strong elements within the libertarian movement, but it's still true that the only philosophy that can really ground the idea of liberty, ground the idea of political freedom, is objectivism.
But you can still hold hands with the people with the wrong philosophy if you share similar or somewhat same.
Yes, as long as at the same time you're not undercutting in some fundamental way your own philosophy by sanctioning something that is really bad.
Right.
So you have to be careful who you hold hands with. You want to make sure they don't have a dagger in their other hand. But yes, we've got in the battle, in the fight that we're engaged in to change the culture, you've got to find allies on particular issues and work with them.
Who are the allies and enemies of the world today?
Well, I think the allies today are anyone who believes in individual freedom and individual liberty and who doesn't undercut it by a real strong subjectivist, push. I think the enemies are primarily the intellectuals. I don't consider the people as enemy. I think that the people to a large extent are innocent victims of the intellectuals. So the enemy really are the economists and philosophers, the political scientists who are teaching, statism and are teaching altruism in all its different forms, are teaching people that reality doesn't really exist, that it's all made up. They're teaching people not to think, that reason is impotent, that reason is incompetent. Those are the real enemies. It's really our professors at the universities. To me, that is the enemy. And people think in terms of politics, but politicians are just products of the culture. Politicians are the implementers of the ideas that the intellectuals are arguing for. So, in the end of the day, intellectuals shape a culture, and the only way to change the world is to change the intellectuals, is to replace them. You're not going to convince them to change their minds. You have to replace them. And to be successful, we're going to have to replace the intellectuals in the world today. They are the enemy.
If anything in the world today makes you optimistic about the future of the world, what would it be?
Well, I think it's two things. One is that in spite of all the bad ideas in the world, in spite of all the growth of statism in the West, and the philosophical deterioration in our educational institutions, people are incredibly productive, innovative, creative. I'm inspired. If there's anything that really inspires me today in the world, it's Silicon Valley. And put aside, they have horrible political ideas. I don't want to ask them about philosophy, but they make cool stuff. They're using their reason. They're using their mind. They're using their independent judgment because they are disrupting. So it's an issue of independence to build a future. And a future that I don't think we could have even imagined 10, 20, 30 years ago. Right? I mean, the iPhone has more computing capacity in it than the computers that send man to the moon. And we have it in our pockets. The internet allows us to access almost every piece of information discovered by the human race in all of time. We can access it by Siri, just like that, by asking a question into our phone. So that inspires me. I mean, that is just amazing. And the idea that is happening in spite of the push by the culture to conform, to moderate, not to think independently, is evidence of how powerful the human mind is and how powerful the capacity of individuals is to overcome. So that inspires me. And the other part of that inspires me is I think the growth in interest in Ayn Rand, the growth in interest in objectivism, both in the United States and I think for the first time on a significant scale internationally. There seems to be a lot of interest in Ayn Rand in all over the world. In Europe, primarily in Eastern Europe, in Scandinavia, in Israel, in Latin America, in South America, and even in Asia, which from a philosophical perspective has not been a part of the philosophical tradition of the West. But there seems to be real interest in her ideas, particularly as a country, let's say, like China, is coming out of this era of communism, is building wealth and building success and is searching for philosophy that makes sense, that explains the world. I think there's real opportunities for Ayn Rand's ideas to have real impact on what happens in places like that.
You make me feel optimistic as well.
Good.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you in
My pleasure. Absolutely.